Have you ever watched a beautiful bird trying to soar with a broken wing? It struggles, it fights against gravity, desperately attempting to reach the heights it once knew. But with every painful flap, it falls shorter and shorter of its... That's exactly what happens to our spirit when we remain trapped in a toxic relationship. You know that feeling, don't you? That heaviness in your chest when you wake up each morning, wondering what emotional storms today might bring. That subtle tension in your shoulders as you walk on eggshells, carefully choosing every word, every action, trying to maintain a fragile peace. The quiet voice inside you that whispers, "This isn't right." While another voice, perhaps louder, more insistent, tells you, "But what if this is as good as it gets?" The space where love should be is too sacred to be filled with fear. Too precious to be contaminated with manipulation, guilt, or shame. Yet so many of us do exactly that. We fill that holy space with toxic substitutes, convincing ourselves that a poisoned well is better than no water at all. I remember sitting with a woman who had spent 18 years in what she called a comfortable prison. Her home was beautiful, her lifestyle enviable from the outside. But her eyes, they told a different story. They held a sadness so deep it seemed to have its own gravity. She told me, "I stay because being alone terrifies me more than being unhappy." And in that moment, I realized how many of us are making the same choice, choosing the familiar pain over the unknown possibility of peace. The opposite of loneliness isn't companionship. It's self-acceptance. The antidote to emptiness isn't another person. It's wholeness. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is stand alone rather than stand diminished. Think about a garden for a moment. When you plant seeds, you don't just throw them anywhere there's space. You prepare the soil, you ensure there's adequate sunlight, you make sure the conditions are right for growth. Why then do we so often plant the precious seeds of our hearts in toxic soil, expecting love to bloom in an environment that can only yield pain? The universe has a perfect accounting system. Every moment you spend in a toxic relationship is a moment stolen from your destiny. Every ounce of emotional energy you invest in trying to fix something fundamentally broken is energy diverted from your truth. Every day you spend hoping someone will change is a day you could have spent becoming who you were meant to be. But I hear you asking, how do you know? How do you distinguish between a relationship that's going through natural challenges and one that's fundamentally toxic? Listen closely, because this is crucial. A healthy relationship adds to your life. It doesn't subtract from your essence. It multiplies your joy. It doesn't divide your spirit. Here are the signs that your relationship might be stealing your soul rather than feeding it. Do you feel smaller in their presence rather than larger? Does your light dim to make space for their darkness? Do you find yourself making excuses for their behavior to others? And worse, to yourself, has your world gradually shrunk to accommodate their insecurities or demands? A toxic relationship is like a slow-acting poison. You might not notice its effects day by day, but over time it changes you. It alters how you see yourself, how you interact with the world, how you imagine your future. It's like living in a house with a carbon monoxide leak. You might get used to the headaches, the dizziness, the fatigue, but that doesn't make them normal or safe. If you had a friend who told you they were staying in a relationship where they were consistently belittled, manipulated, or made to feel inadequate, what would you tell them? Would you say, "Well, at least you're not alone"? Would you advise them to stay because relationships take work? Of course not. You would tell them they deserve better. You would remind them of their worth. You would encourage them to choose themselves. So why do we so often fail to give ourselves the same grace, the same permission to choose our own well-being? Why do we reserve our compassion for others while denying it to ourselves? I've observed that many of us stay in toxic relationships, not because we don't know they're toxic, but because we've convinced ourselves that the toxicity is somehow our fault. That if we were just better, more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, the relationship would... This is perhaps the most poisonous lie of all. You cannot love someone into loving you properly. You cannot sacrifice yourself into making someone whole. You cannot dim your light enough to make someone else's darkness comfortable. These are hard truths. The real question isn't, why is this relationship toxic? The real question is, why do I believe I deserve the toxicity? Because here's another truth that might shake you to your core. We don't attract what we want. We attract what we believe we deserve. If you find yourself continuously drawn to relationships that diminish you, it's time to examine your relationship with yourself. What stories are you telling yourself about your worth? What wounds from your past are you trying to heal through others? What emptiness are you trying to fill with another person's presence? The space between relationships isn't empty. It's fertile. It's not a void to be feared, but a garden to be tended. This is where you get to rediscover your own voice without interference. This is where you get to reconstruct your boundaries without resistance. This is where you get to remember who you are without anyone else's definitions or expectations clouding your vision. Some of you might be thinking, but what about commitment? What about working through difficulties? Aren't all relationships challenging at times? Yes, absolutely. But there's a profound difference between a relationship that's going through challenges and one that is fundamentally challenging your right to be yourself. Healthy relationships have conflicts, but they don't have contempt. They have disagreements, but not disrespect. They have problems, but not patterns of degradation. In a healthy relationship, both people are committed to growth, both individual. In a toxic relationship, one person's growth is often seen as a threat to the other's control. Let me share something powerful with you. The most important relationship you'll ever have isn't with a romantic partner. It's with yourself. And every time you stay in a toxic relationship, you're breaking trust with that primary relationship. You're telling yourself that your peace, your joy, your emotional well-being are negotiable. They're not. Think about how we treat physical poison. If you discovered that your drinking water was contaminated, would you continue drinking it because you were thirsty? Would you say, well, at least there's something to drink? Of course not. You would immediately stop, no matter how thirsty you were, because you understand that poison doesn't quench thirst. It only creates more harm. Emotional poison works the same way. A toxic relationship doesn't satisfy a need for love and connection. It creates an even deeper spiritual thirst while simultaneously convincing us that this poison well is all we deserve. Many of us stay in toxic relationships because we've confused familiarity with safety. We've mistaken intensity for intimacy. We've accepted drama as a substitute for passion. But let me tell you something that might change your life. Peace is not stability, is not stagnation. Calm is not the absence of love. It's the presence of harmony. I want you to do something right now. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine your perfect day. Not a fantasy of exotic locations or material luxuries, but just a simple, perfect day in your life. Notice how your body feels in this visualization. Notice your breathing, your shoulders, your jaw. Notice the sense of peace that comes over you. Be honest with yourself. Does your current relationship support or sabotage that vision? Does the person you're with add to that peace or disturb it? Because here's another truth. A relationship should multiply your joy, not divide your. We often hear that relationships take work, and that's true. But there's a profound difference between working on a relationship and having to work to survive a relationship. One builds you up, the other breaks you down. One energizes you, the other exhausts you. One brings out your best self, the other demands you become someone else. You might be thinking, but they're not always toxic. There are good moments too. Of course there are. That's how toxic relationships survive. They offer just enough hope to keep you invested, just enough good moments to make you doubt your decision to leave, just enough glimpses of what could be to make you forget what is. But imagine feeding someone a meal that's only 20 poison. Would the 80 good food make the poison acceptable? Would you say, well, most of it is nourishing? No, because poison is poison, and even a little bit over time can be lethal to your soul. Let's talk about something that many of us struggle with, the fear of being alone. Society has programmed us to believe that being in a relationship, any relationship, is better than being single. We see it in our media, our cultural narratives, even in the well-meaning questions from family and friends. When are you going to settle down? As if settling for less than you deserve is better than standing alone in your truth. But here's what they don't tell you about being alone. It's not a punishment, it's preparation. It's not empty space, it's sacred space. It's not an absence of love. It's an opportunity to learn how to love yourself so completely that you'll never again accept relationships that don't match your own love. When you're in a toxic relationship, you're never really giving yourself the chance to meet the right person. It's like trying to shop for new furniture while your house is full of broken pieces. You need to clear the space first. You need to be brave enough to live with some emptiness so that you can fill it with something better. Think about this. Every moment you spend in a toxic relationship is a moment you're telling the universe, this is what I think I deserve. And the universe, in its infinite wisdom, will continue to prove you right until you change that fundamental belief about yourself. Some of you might be holding on because you've invested so much time already. You're thinking, if I leave now, all these years will have been wasted. This is what economists call the sunk cost fallacy. The idea that we should continue investing in something because of our past investments, rather than evaluating its future value. But time spent learning what you don't want is never wasted time. Every toxic relationship has something to teach us about ourselves, about our boundaries, about what we truly want and need. The only real waste would be to ignore these lessons and continue repeating the same patterns. You don't need a reason to leave a relationship that doesn't feel right. You don't need to gather evidence or build a case. You don't need to wait for something dramatic to happen. Your intuition, that quiet voice inside that says this isn't right, is reason enough. Many of us stay because we're waiting for the other person to change. We see their potential, and we think if we just love them enough, if we're just patient enough, if we just find the right words or the right moment, they'll become who we know they could be. But people only change when they want to change, not when we want them to change. Your love, no matter how pure, how patient, how unconditional, cannot transform someone who isn't ready or willing to transform themselves. And more importantly, it's not your job to transform them. Your job is to be true to yourself, to honor your own spirit, to protect your own peace. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the other person, is to let go. Because as long as you're accepting toxic behavior, you're enabling it. As long as you're staying out of fear, guilt, or habit, you're participating in your own diminishment. Think about the message you're sending to your children, whether you have them now or might have them in the future. What are you teaching them about love, about self-respect, about what they should accept in their own relationships? Remember, children learn more from what we do than what we say. They learn their worth from watching how we honor or dishonor our own. There's something profound that happens when you finally choose yourself. It's like watching a sunrise after the longest night of your life. Colors seem brighter, air feels cleaner, your very breath becomes a celebration of freedom rather than an exercise in survival. But I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking about practical things, finances, shared responsibilities, mutual friends, family complications. You're thinking about the logistics of leaving, and those thoughts feel overwhelming. That's normal. That's human. But here's what I want you to understand. Every great journey begins with a decision, not with a detailed roadmap. When you're climbing a mountain, you don't need to see the entire path to the summit. You just need to see the next step. And then the next. And then the next. The same is true for leaving a toxic relationship. You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to make the decision that you deserve better. The how will follow the why. Let's talk about something that keeps many people trapped. The illusion of security. A toxic relationship can feel like a familiar prison. You know, every brick, every bar, every shadow. The thought of leaving this familiar confinement for the unknown can feel. There is no security in toxicity. There is no stability in chaos. There is no safety in surrendering your soul. Real security comes from within. It comes from knowing who you are and standing firmly in that truth. It comes from building a relationship with yourself that's so strong, so unshakable, that you would rather walk alone than walk with someone who diminishes you. Think about a tree for a moment. A tree doesn't need another tree to stand tall. It doesn't need external permission to grow, to reach for the sunlight, to sink its roots deep into the earth. Its strength comes from within, from its own core, from its own nature. You are like that tree. Your ability to stand alone is already within you, even if you haven't tested it yet. Some of you might be wondering about forgiveness. You might be thinking that if you could just forgive more completely, love more unconditionally, understand more deeply, the relationship would heal. But here's another truth that might shake you. Understanding doesn't mean accepting. Love doesn't mean sacrificing your well-being. True forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the burden of bitterness, not about giving someone permanent permission to hurt you. True understanding means seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. True love includes loving yourself enough to walk away from what harms you. I want to address something that many people struggle with, the fear of judgment. You might be worried about what others will think if you leave. You might be concerned about being labeled as someone who couldn't make it work or who gave up too easily. But let me ask you something. Would you rather have the approval of others or the approval of your own soul? The people who judge you for leaving a toxic relationship have never stood where you're standing. They've never felt what you're feeling. They've never had to choose between their peace and others' expectations. Their opinions are like clouds passing across the sky, temporary and substantial, and not worth organizing your life around. The relationship you have with yourself sets the tone for every other relationship in your life. When you accept toxic behavior from others, you're telling yourself a story about what you deserve. When you stay in an environment that diminishes you, you're writing a script about your worth. It's time to write a new story. Think about your future self for a moment. Imagine yourself 5 years from now. What would that future version of you want you to do right now? Would they thank you for staying, for continuing to shrink yourself, for accepting less than you deserve? Or would they wish you had found the courage sooner? Would they celebrate the moment you finally chose yourself? Some of you might be thinking about past attempts to leave that weren't successful. Maybe you left before and went back. Maybe you made plans but couldn't follow through. Maybe you spoke up, but then your past attempts weren't failures. They were practice. They were you building your strength, gathering your courage, preparing for the moment when you would finally break free. Every time you've tried to leave, every time you've spoken up, every time you've set a boundary, even if it wasn't maintained, you were strengthening your inner resolve. You were laying the groundwork for your eventual freedom. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was in vain. Let's talk about something that often keeps people trapped, the fear of starting over. Society often makes us feel like there's a timeline for life, like we're somehow behind if we're single at a certain age or starting over when others are settling down. But life isn't a race, and there's no universal timeline that you need to follow. Starting over isn't failing. It's refusing to accept failure as your destiny. It's having the courage to say this isn't good enough for me and the wisdom to know that solitude is better than toxic company. It's understanding that it's never too late to begin again. Never too late to rewrite your story. Never too late to choose yourself. Every moment you stay in a toxic relationship is a moment you're teaching someone that it's okay to treat you badly. Every day you accept less than you deserve is a day you're reinforcing the idea that you don't deserve more. Every time you silence your inner voice that says this isn't right, you're making that voice weaker. But the opposite is also true. Every time you choose yourself, you're teaching others how to treat you. Every time you maintain a boundary, you're strengthening your self-respect. Every time you walk away from what diminishes you, you're walking toward what will elevate you. There's a special kind of strength that comes from standing alone. Not because you want to be alone forever, but because you're no longer willing to accept relationships that cost you your peace, your joy, your sense of self. This strength doesn't come from hardening your heart, but from loving yourself enough to protect it. One of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed is watching someone rediscover their own light after leaving a toxic relationship. It's like watching a flower that's been kept in the dark finally feel the sun. At first, it might seem fragile, uncertain, maybe even afraid of its own beauty. But day by day, petal by petal, it unfolds into something magnificent. That's what happens when you choose yourself. You don't just leave a toxic relationship. You begin a sacred journey back to your own heart. And yes, this journey can feel frightening. Yes, there will be moments of doubt. Yes, there will be days when loneliness feels like a physical weight on your chest. It has a purpose. Like physical pain tells you something's wrong with your body. Emotional loneliness often tells you something's wrong with your relationship patterns. The discomfort You feel being alone might not be about being alone at all. It might be your soul's way of telling you it's time to heal. When you break a bone, doctors sometimes need to re-break it to help it heal properly. In the same way, sometimes we need to break our patterns, our habits, our attachments to toxic relationships in order to heal properly. And yes, this breaking hurts, but it's a purposeful pain, a healing pain, a pain that leads to strength rather than weakness. Let me share something profound with you. The universe abhors a vacuum. When you create space in your life by removing toxic relationships, you're not just creating emptiness, you're creating possibility. You're making room for better things to enter. You're declaring to the universe, I am ready for more, I am worthy of better, I am prepared to receive what truly belongs in my life. But here's the key. You have to maintain that space. You have to resist the urge to fill it with the first person who comes along. You have to be willing to sit with the discomfort of transformation, because that's what this is. It's not just about ending a relationship, it's about transforming yourself. Think about a sculptor working with marble. They don't just chip away at the stone randomly. They remove everything that isn't part of their vision. In the same way, leaving a toxic relationship isn't just about what you're leaving behind. It's about revealing the masterpiece that's always been within you. Some of you might be thinking about the good times, those moments when things seem perfect, when you caught a glimpse of what could be. Those memories can be like hooks in your heart, pulling you back just when you're ready to move forward. But remember this, a few beautiful moments don't justify years of pain. A few perfect days don't make up for countless days of diminishment. It's like having a beautiful painting in a house that's falling apart. Yes, the painting is lovely, but if the house is toxic, if the foundation is crumbling, if the air is making you sick, you need to leave, even if it means leaving that beautiful painting behind. The capacity for those beautiful moments is within you, not within the toxic relationship. The joy you felt, the love you experienced, the peace you glimpsed, these aren't things that someone else gave you. They're expressions of your own capacity for joy, love, and peace. And they can exist. They should exist without the cost of toxicity. Let's talk about something that often keeps people trapped, the idea of potential. But they could be so amazing if only they would change, if only they would get help, if only they would understand. But potential is like a seed. It needs the right conditions to grow. You cannot water a seed with your tears and expect it to flourish. Your love, your patience, your understanding, these are precious resources. And just like any resource, they need to be invested wisely. Investing them in someone who consistently shows you they're not ready or willing to change is like planting seeds in concrete and wondering why they won't grow. Many of you have become experts at explaining away toxic behavior. You've become masters at making excuses, at finding reasons, at understanding the why behind every hurt. But understanding why someone hurts you doesn't make the hurt any less. Understanding their past trauma doesn't mean you have to accept their present behavior. Think about this. Every time you accept toxic behavior, you're not just affecting your present. You're programming your future. You're setting the precedent for what you'll accept tomorrow, next week, next year. You're teaching not just this person, but every future person how to treat you. Some of you might be staying because you believe you can help them. You see their pain, their struggles, their own wounds, and your heart aches to heal them. But here's a truth that took me years to learn. You cannot heal someone by allowing them to hurt you. You cannot save someone by drowning yourself. It's like being on an airplane. There's a reason they tell you to put on your own oxygen mask first. Because if you run out of oxygen trying to help someone else, you both end up suffering. The same principle applies to emotional well-being. You cannot give from an empty cup. You cannot offer healing. And let's address something that many people struggle with, the fear of being seen as selfish. Society often teaches us, especially women, that putting ourselves first is somehow wrong, that choosing our own well-being over someone else's comfort is selfish. But this is another toxic lie that keeps us trapped. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's sacred. Protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's necessary. Choosing your own well-being isn't selfish, it's survival. In fact, it's the most responsible thing you can do. Because when you're healthy emotionally, mentally, spiritually, you're in a much better position to truly help others. Think about it this way. If you had a friend who was stuck in quicksand, would you jump in to save them? Of course not, because then you'd both be stuck. You would find solid ground first, then reach out to help. The same principle applies to relationships. You need to find your own solid ground, your own stability, your own strength before you can truly help anyone else. What if I told you that the moment you're most afraid of, being alone, could become the moment that sets you free? What if the very thing you're running from is actually running towards you with a gift in its hands? The gift of rediscovery, the gift of reconnection with your own spirit, the gift of remembering who you were before the world told you who you should be. You see, being alone isn't a punishment, it's an opportunity for renaissance. It's your soul's way of creating space for a rebirth. Think about a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. During transformation, during its most vulnerable moment, it must trust the process. During its breakthrough, it must rely on its own strength. Some of you have been in toxic relationships for so long that you've forgotten what peace feels like. You've forgotten what it's like to wake up without that knot in your stomach. You've forgotten what it's like to speak without first running your words through a filter. You've forgotten what it's like to breathe without feeling the weight of walking on eggshells. But your body remembers, your spirit remembers, your soul remembers, and they've been waiting for you to remember too. They've been waiting for you to say, enough. I deserve more than this. I am worth more than this. I am ready for more than this. Let me share something powerful with you. The moment you truly decide to leave a toxic relationship isn't when you pack your bags, or when you say the words, or when you walk out the door. The real moment of leaving happens in your heart, when something deep inside you finally says no more. Everything that follows is just logistics. Some of you might be thinking, but what if I never find anyone else? Let me turn that question around. If you find yourself, what if, in the process of being alone, you discover that you are not actually alone at all, that you have been walking with a warrior all along, and that warrior is you? Think about all the energy you've been putting into making a toxic relationship work. All the mental gymnastics, all the emotional labor, all the spiritual compromise. Now imagine redirecting all that energy into yourself. Imagine investing all that love, all that patience, all that understanding into your own growth, your own healing, your own joy. Because there's another truth that might set you free. The relationship you have with yourself is the only relationship you're guaranteed to have for the rest of your life. It's the foundation upon which every other relationship will be built. And if that foundation is built on self-compromise, self-doubt, and self-abandonment, how can it support anything healthy? I want you to do something right now. Put your hand on your heart. Feel its beat. That rhythm you're feeling, that's not just your heart beating. That's your spirit knocking. It's been knocking all along, trying to get your attention, trying to tell you something important. You are worthy of love that doesn't hurt. You are deserving of relationships that don't require you to be less than who you are. You are ready for connections that expand your spirit rather than shrink your soul. Some of you might be wondering about timing. When is the right time to leave? The answer is simple. The right time is when you decide it's right. Not when others understand, not when the circumstances are perfect, not when everyone agrees with your decision. The right time is when your inner wisdom speaks louder than your fears. Think about seasons for a moment. Winter doesn't ask permission to turn into spring. The sun doesn't negotiate with the moon about when to rise. Nature moves in perfect timing, not by consulting a clock, but by following its own inner wisdom. You have that same wisdom within you. Trust it. Every moment you spend in a toxic relationship is a moment you're teaching the universe what you're willing to accept. Every day you stay is a day. You're saying, this is what I think love looks like. Every time you accept less than you deserve, you're writing a contract with life about what you believe you're worth. But you can tear up that contract at any moment. You can write a new one. You can declare to the universe, I am ready for something better. I am prepared for healthy love. I am available for connections that honor my spirit rather than diminish it. The end of a toxic relationship is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a better one. It's not a period. It's a semicolon. It's not a wall. It's a door. And on the other side of that door is everything you've been too afraid to believe you deserve. By some of you might be thinking about all the time you've already invested, all the years you've already spent. But consider this: time doesn't make a mistake more valid. Duration doesn't make toxicity more acceptable. Length of investment doesn't make diminishment more justifiable. Think about it this way. If you realized you were walking in the wrong direction, would you keep walking just because you've already gone 5 miles? Of course not. You would turn around. You would choose a new direction. You would trust that walking toward what's right is better than continuing in what's wrong, no matter how far you've already gone. As we come to the close of our time together, I want to leave you with this. Your life is not a democracy. You don't need anyone's permission to leave what hurts you. You don't need a consensus to choose yourself. You don't need approval to protect your peace. The only vote that matters is your own. And every day you're voting either for or against yourself with your choices, your actions, your willingness to stay, or your courage to leave. Right now, in this moment, I want you to make a promise to yourself. Promise that you will no longer negotiate with toxicity. Promise that you will no longer compromise with chaos. Promise that you will no longer settle for less than you deserve. Being alone might feel scary, but it's nowhere near as scary as losing yourself in someone else's darkness. Being single might feel uncomfortable, but it's nowhere near as uncomfortable as being in a relationship that requires you to be smaller than you are. Your journey to freedom begins with a single step. Not a step away from someone else, but a step toward yourself, a step toward your truth, a step toward your worth, a step toward the life you deserve and the love you were meant to experience. No relationship is better than a toxic one, because no relationship leaves room for the right one, including the most important relationship of all, the one you have with yourself. You are not alone in this journey, even in your solitude. You are surrounded by the strength of every person who has ever chosen themselves, every soul who has ever said enough, every spirit who has ever trusted that being alone was better than being diminished. Take that strength with you. Let it fuel your courage. Let it guide your steps. Let it remind you that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred. And in that sacredness, in that holy space of self-love and self-respect, you will find not just survival, but revival. Not just healing, but transformation. Not just peace, but power. Your new life is waiting. Your true self is calling. Your future self is cheering you on. Answer the call. Take the step. Choose yourself. The rest will follow.